Hi there, so today I've got a short documentary for you which has been shot on location. But just before we get into that, I wanted to drop in and thank our sponsor for this episode, which is Brilliant. Sponsors on videos like this, they make it all possible. So to support Today I Found Out and learn more about Brilliant, please go to brilliant.org/todayifoundout and sign up for free. So let's get into it. Welcome to Amsterdam, the Netherlands, a country famous for many things, one of them actually being tulips. And yes, we do have a video covering Amsterdam's famous other botanical item, which you can find a link to below this video. Despite how wonderful tulips look, and however it might sound, Tulipmania does not just refer to a love of tulips. It was actually one of the world's first major financial bubbles. Long before the dot-com frenzy or the real estate bubble, there was Tulipmania in the Netherlands. It began in 1624 and reached its peak from 1636 to 1637. While the extent of the mania in terms of how widespread it was is still largely debated, tulip prices in the Netherlands rose to ridiculous levels, with one flower costing more than the annual income of a skilled tradesman. Certain types of tulips, though, they could rise to 10 times that annual salary. So why the frenzy over tulips? I mean, it seems so run-of-the-mill. I mean, almost every household in Middle America has some tulips blooming in their yard. To Dutch horticulturalists of the 17th century, the tulip was lauded as exquisitely unique and was put on a high pedestal. The colours were far richer, lush and concentrated than those of just about any other flower in Europe. The Dutch people quickly became enamoured with the tulip, and having tulips in your garden was soon something of a status symbol. Once this psychological component was in place, the ground was made fertile for a buying craze and a bubble. The life cycle of the tulip itself was another factor in the buying squeeze and the frenzy. The mother bulb of a tulip only lasts a few years and can only produce 2 to 3 clones per year, and it takes a full 7 years to grow a tulip from a seed. While the demand of tulip buyers spiked through Tulipmania, the supply of actual tulip bulbs did not. Tulip bulb prices rose at a steady pace through the 1630s as more and more speculators entered the market. These speculators comprised mostly of wealthy merchants and tradesmen rather than members of the nobility, who were the traditional investors. For this reason, tulip trading tended to take place more in taverns than at the stock exchange. By 1636, any tulip, even low-quality bulbs, could be sold for a small fortune, with an average price of about 160 guilders, and at its peak, nearly 200 guilders. Unfortunately, there's not really an accurate way to translate that to modern-day currency, but for reference, a typical skilled tradesman at this time generally only made about 150 guilders per year. So if you wanted to translate it that way, a typical skilled worker today in the United States averages about $48,000 per year. So using that extremely loose correlation, an average tulip bulb would cost around $64,000 at the mania's peak. At its peak in 1636, some tulip bulbs were changing hands 10 times a day, with some people never even actually taking possession of the bulbs, simply purchasing them in the futures market and trying to sell them for a profit. In fact, with many of these exchanges, not only did the bulbs not change hands, but money didn't either at this time, with the exchange to happen when the bulbs were physically taken possession of, which was no longer really happening in most cases. The height of the frenzy came in a famous incident when 7 orphaned children auctioned off their inheritance from their deceased father. It was 70 tulip bulbs. One of them was an extremely rare, and I apologize for the pronunciation, Violetten Admiralen van Enkhuizen bulb, which ended up selling for 5,200 guilders, which was an all-time record. The total yield of the auction was 53,000 guilders for 70 bulbs. In another auction in 1635, 40 bulbs were sold for 100,000 guilders. Again, a typical skilled tradesman at this time only made 150 guilders per year. According to British journalist Charles Mackay in his book Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, published in 1841, and I should note here that some economists do speculate that he exaggerated some of the extent of the mania, but he said, many individuals grew suddenly rich, a golden bait hung temptingly out before the people, and one after the other Rather, they rushed to the tulip marts like flies around a honeypot. Everyone imagined that the passion for tulips would last forever and that the wealthy from every part of the world would send to Holland and pay whatever prices were asked for them. The riches of Europe would be so concentrated on the shores of the Zuiderzee and poverty banished from the favoured clime of Holland. Nobles, citizens, farmers, mechanics, seamen, footmen, maidservants, even chimney sweeps and old clothes women dabbled in tulips. In another instance, he stated that a Semper Augustus bulb was traded for 12 acres of farmland. But not long after this, the tulip market, it crashed in spectacular fashion. There was nothing gradual about it. It began in the city of Haarlem at a routine bulb auction when an investor did not show up and pay for his purchase. This started people worrying over the fact that no one seemed to actually buy any bulbs to acquire the actual tulips. Rather, they were simply buying them to turn around and sell them again. Thus, without any buyers and without any sellers, widespread panic ensued with the tulip traders. Some of the more savvy investors tried to prop up the market, but it quickly dried up and the market completely evaporated. Tulips that fetched a few thousand guilders just weeks before were now nearly valued at a single percentage of that. Surprisingly, the fallout from this doesn't appear to have been very drastic. While some lost their fortunes, most simply paid small penalties for not honouring their tulip contracts and moved on with their lives. This combines with the fact that most of the trading took place on Main Street rather than at the stock exchange and among nobility, and that no money or tulips changed hands during the height of the bubble. The result on the overall economy was not very severe, contrary to what you may often read. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and do let us know what you think in the comments below. Now, this sort of video does take a lot longer to make, as you can probably tell, so I'd like to thank our patrons on Patreon for this because they really do make it possible. If you want to support us making videos like this, please do consider heading over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/TodayIFoundOut. And as always, thank you for watching. Alright, so as I said, I really hope you enjoyed that one, and I just wanted to jump in at the end to say that these sorts of complex videos are made possible because of our sponsors like Brilliant. Now, you've heard me talk about Brilliant previously. They're a fantastic complement to passively watching educational videos like this one. Whether you want to learn about maths, finance, or indeed the maths behind finance relevant to this video, Brilliant allow you to do that. They allow you to learn maths by actively solving problems. It's a method of learning called active learning, and it really is incredibly effective. Well, in the video today, we talked all about the tulip bubble, but economic bubbles like that one have been happening for centuries, many times over. But if you want to get a deeper understanding of why, well, you can use Brilliant to get a grasp of quantitative finance and how financial markets are modeled. When using applied mathematics like this, blind memorization of formulas isn't really going to be helpful. In fact, I'd say that it actually limits your critical thinking ability. But Brilliant, they provide you the toolkit to think through problems and actually solve them. What's remarkable with Brilliant is how quickly what you learn becomes immediately applicable. So you can support Today I Found Out and learn more about Brilliant by going to brilliant.org/TodayIFoundOut and signing up for free. Also, the first 200 people to go through that link will get 20% off the annual premium subscription. So thanks to Brilliant for the sponsorship, and thank you for watching.